Fellas, I've been wanting to make this comparison ever since I first saw that we were going to be getting a normal version of Pally, which is godly all on its own, and an Adept version. Now, I was really starting to sweat bullets because this was my God Roll Pally, which is incredibly hard to top. But we have no light Grandmaster Nightfalls this week, and we finally landed this bad baby right here, amongst a number of other rolls. We're going to be talking about this weapon today, guys, for both PvE and for PvP, how it stacks against the normal Palindrome, and is the Adept version worth all the trouble? First, I do want to mention that yes, Adept Palindromes are dropping from the Proving Grounds Grandmaster strike, which is a very difficult strike to do, meaning there will be a strike in the future that will be easier, thus resulting in a better Palindrome farm. Now, this is my roll right here that we landed yesterday, and fellas, it don't get much better than this. Small bore, which turns out might be my favorite barrel perk, as it bumps not only your range, but also your stability. And in this sandbox, even though we still talk about range and we like to commit to range, stability is just as important. We also have ricochet rounds for that +5 in range, as well as +9 in stability. Quick draw for that unbelievable draw time speed, essentially maxing out our handling, as well as rangefinder. Aiming this weapon increases its effective range and zoom magnification. Perk-wise, nothing here is different from the normal Pally. Where Adept Pally really starts to separate itself is in two categories: the masterwork and the mods. First, the masterwork. When you masterwork an Adept weapon completely, it actually tacks on +3 in all of your other stats. So for instance, this Palindrome right here, which comes with a ranged masterwork, adds on the +10 there to range, but simultaneously bumps my stability, handling, and reload, which by the way is pretty ginormous. Look at that stability stat of +80. That's insane. The second way Adept weapons separate themselves is in the mods. Now, you have access to just your normal regular mods, which is still really good, but you also gain access to Adept mods. These are mods that can be obtained both in Trials of Osiris as well as Grandmaster Nightfalls. Things like Adept Stability for +10 stability, Adept Range, Adept Handling. Probably the most popular one inside of PvP is Adept Icarus, as it not only improves your airborne accuracy, but it also gives you a +5 there to your range stat. And in this season, we actually gain access to a new mod called Adept Big One Spec, which is great on PvE rolls, as this essentially merges both boss spec and major spec together. Now, the clear winner for PvP for me is still Adept Icarus, although I did try out things like Adept Stability, Adept Range, and we actually start sitting down and testing the range of this weapon. All of this was pretty interesting. First up, a normal Palindrome with no rangefinder will start to receive damage fall off at around 32 to 32.5 meters. Now, with rangefinder, as well as Adept Icarus, all these things, this does kick up the range to about 36.5 meters. And if I was to apply the +10 range mod, that just barely pushes it over to 37 meters. Now, the range differences between my Adept Pally and my normal Pally is 79 to 78, which doesn't make that big of a difference. Matter of fact, when swapping back and forth between both of these weapons, while remaining still and less still staying in the same spot, our damage doesn't really deviate more than 1. But you remember in the previous review, when we reviewed the normal Pally, I had stated in that review, though, that I had trouble with rangefinder. Again, rangefinder zooms in your weapon more, thus making your accuracy cone more narrow. And you can see the picture right here with rangefinder. Look how it's zoomed in, and then without rangefinder, see how it zooms out? You would think being zoomed in more would help you, right? But due to that accuracy cone being more narrow, you do have to be more precise, which is how Bungie really handles a lot of things in this game. Whether it's mods or perks like these, they're double-edged swords, which is why we stated in that previous review that you may want to go with a more consistent Palindrome, something like Killing Wind and High Impact Reserves. Secure the 2 crit 1 body on Guardians while simultaneously dominating everything in that 32-meter range all the way down. However, with the Adept version, I found that this Palindrome just felt better. Like, maybe it's in my head. Maybe I'm trying to justify all the time I've spent grinding Grandmaster Nightfalls. But I do think that the stability stat here was actually making a difference. +80 stability due to ricochet rounds and small bore, as well as that +3 from the masterwork, all seemed to greatly help, at least in terms of consistency. And that was the main thing that was driving me away from our previous God Roll, was because I felt like it would lose out in consistency even at those optimal ranges. I felt powerful with this hand cannon, and within that 36-37 meter range and less, I felt confident in this Palindrome. Now, this doesn't mean stand in the middle of the open at 40 meters and try to duel out with Bottom Dollar or Igneous Hammer. Obviously, those hand cannons will have you beat at range. But as soon as I got one of those 120s within my territory, it was game over. Pally would beat them. And TTK-wise, 140s do beat 120s with a default 0.87 time to kill value versus 1 second. Granted, 120s are more forgiving, and I do hope that Adaptive someday get more forgiving and And when that day comes, and I think it's gonna come, remember back inside of Destiny 1, 140 round per minute hand cannons can 1 crit 2 body. I don't think it's gonna get to that point, but I do believe we may get to a point where adaptives can 2 crit 1 body. When that moment comes, Palindrome here will absolutely be meta. And it already feels fantastic. Given the right map, and there are certain trial maps that I feel comfortable using Pally, I will be using this God Roll every single time. So is the Adept version of Pally noticeably better than the normal version of Pally? What this really boils down to, guys, is your particular role. Up until I got this God Roll on this Adept version, I had no intention of replacing my normal palette. That role was already too solid. So take the role first, not necessarily the parentheses Adept. Because at the end of the day, if your Adept Palindrome has Unrelenting and Bottomless Grief, no matter what, that hand cannon still poop. So don't scrap your previous God Rolls just because you landed an Adept version of this weapon. And as far as God Rolls for PvP, I do like Quick Draw and Rangefinder, especially on the Adept version with perks like Small Bore. I want to see if I can actually bring in high caliber rounds instead of Ricochet. Even though Ricochet is nice and it bumps up that stability, can we live with just high cal here? Because that flinch, especially against other 120s, is really nice. Killing Wind is also a great one though, guys, especially when combined with Rampage. And again, don't overlook high impact reserves. That perk right there, yes, it requires you to get to the bottom half of your magazine, but if you have magazine boosting perks, or if you load out Adept Backup Mag, which is present here on these Adept weapons, you could prime your weapon down, having a more forgivable 140 round per minute hand cannon here, which might help you secure a kill inside game modes like Trials with that 2 crit 1 body. Overall, guys, this hand cannon was performing very well inside of PvP. Extremely impressed with it, but now let's move on to PvE. Now, I was landing all kinds of rolls. A ton for PvE. Things like One for All and Overflow, which is actually a fantastic combination here. Rampage Overflow, Rampage Subsistence, One for All, and Subsistence. And that's actually the role that I really started to play with. One for All and Subsistence. I've grown to love One for All. That 35% buff there in damage by simply tagging 3 targets. Fellas, that's weapons of light. You're able to walk flat-footed with an extra 35% buff there in damage. And I love combining that with Subsistence. Essentially, every shot was taken out an enemy, thus reloading my weapon. And yes, I finally got to combine it with Adept Big One Spec. Now, unfortunately, Adept Big One Spec is only Major Spec and Boss Spec. Kind of wish they took Minor Spec and merged it in there as well. But no, I did try throwing on Adept Backup Mag, but the mag here does cap out at 14, which is interesting because I don't know what they're going to do about Bottomless Grief. Yes, it's getting a buff. Bottomless Grief is actually going to give us a plus 30 there to our magazine size. No, it's not actually plus 30 rounds. Essentially, it's the same as Extended Mag. Extended Mag also gives plus 30 to our magazine. What I'm concerned about is that the cap here for our magazine size on most of our weapons, and especially Pally here, is still going to remain the same, which means perks like Bottomless Grief isn't really going to go over that threshold, but just serves as a means to replace other perks, which is kind of unfortunate. Like, I'm concerned that Bottomless Grief is just going to be a perk that's like, oh, well, you don't have to rock a mag perk now, or you don't have to rock backup mag, which, don't get me wrong, there's still going to be some value in it, and a hell of a lot more value than what's there now, but understand those are the limitations with magazine size. But for PvE, hands down, One for All, Rampage, in combination with Overflow, Outlaw, Subsistence are all fantastic perk combinations, and depending on how Bottomless Grief handles that cap there to magazine, who knows? It may be top tier too. We're just gonna have to wait and see. So guys, that is Pally, a fantastic 140 round per minute hand cannon, definitely top tier, one of the best. And yes, we did play on controller with it, and it feels just as good on controller. I do think this hand cannon is worth getting, but don't kill yourself over it. There will be an easier Nightfall to grind, and I'm pretty sure at some point we're gonna get like 1 week of Nightfalls where we can choose whatever Nightfall we want, and if we're lucky, that week will also be double loot. So let me know in the comments below what you think of this hand cannon. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.